Okay, everybody, so welcome to the 9th in our series of CAQDAS webinars that are organised by the CAQDAS Networking Project, which is based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey. My name is Christina Silva, and I'm joined by my colleague today, Dr. Sarah Bullock, in hosting this webinar for you. Before we get started, just to remind you that we've got 2 more webinars scheduled between now and the end of March, so do keep an eye on those. We're also delighted to be able to announce today that our webinar series is going to be continuing until July at least, and we'll shortly be advertising webinars which will be taking place between March and July. So really hope to see you at some of those as well. All of our webinars are recorded, and you'll get sent a link to the recording of this one, as well as all the recordings being available on our YouTube channel. Also, if you're interested in contributing to our webinar series, please do get in touch. We're always looking for users and methodologists to discuss their use of qualitative software. So if you'd like to share some of your experiences via one of our webinars, that would be great. We'd also like to draw your attention to our online training that we have coming up. We've got 4 courses coming up soon. And as you may know, we were able to discount our training courses to support researchers and students who are currently working from home, and those discounts are continuing for the foreseeable future. So I will move on and start to get onto the business of today. But just to say at the outset, please do keep your video and your audio off during the main part of the session. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, please do that in the chat area, and Sarah and myself will collate those and pose those at the end. So let me welcome our speaker for today, who is Rachel Brooks, Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey, where we're based also, so a long-standing colleague and friend of ours. And we're delighted to have Rachel here present a webinar in our user stream. Rachel's research interests are in the sociology of education, and particularly higher education, but also youth studies and the sociology of the family. She's currently an executive editor of the British Journal of Sociology of Education, a co-editor of the Research into Higher Education book series, and also a member of the Governing Council of the Society for Research into Higher Education, as well as being a member of the Education Subpanel for the REF 2021. In addition, and the reason that Rachel's with us today is that she is Principal Investigator on the Euro Students Project, a study funded by the European Research Council Consolidator Grant. And Rachel and her colleagues have made use of the qualitative software NVivo to manage their project and to analyse the data. And it's this project and the use of NVivo that Rachel is going to be talking about with us today. As I said, while she's speaking, please feel free to post your questions or comments in chat. But for now, thanks for being here, Rachel. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Christina. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. Let me just share my screen. Can you see that okay?
That's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Rachel.
Right, so yeah, I'm going to be giving this talk today, but on the call are also some of my colleagues who I've been working with in the recent past on this project, Achla Gupta, Sazana Jayadeva and Anu Lanyo. I'm not sure if Anu's here, but Achla and Sazana are too, so they might be able to join in the Q&A at the end if you'd like us to. So I started off on this journey in 2016, and I attended an NVivo training session that Christina and Sarah ran, which was really instrumental in getting me to think about the organisation and management of the data for my project at a really early stage. So I am extremely grateful to them for that, because it was actually extremely influential in how we went about structuring the project. Okay, so today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, I suppose, the rationale for the project, what it's about, its substantive focus. So why research European higher education students? Why do I think they're an interesting group to look at? I'm going to, in answering that question, I'm going to engage a little bit with some debates about whether students are becoming increasingly similar across the world, and particularly across Europe. And then I'm just going to outline the aims and research questions that underpin this project, the Euro Students project. So that's a little bit of background so that you understand what we're trying to do in the project. Then I'm just going to talk in a bit more detail about our methodological approach so that you understand the kind of data that we've been collecting. And then I'm going to go on to how we used NVivo for the project. I'm going to talk about how it was really useful in terms of both managing the data and then the analytical process as well. So I'll show you the project and a few other documents that we used in talking through that. Then I'm going to reflect on some strengths and also some limitations in relation to our use of NVivo for this particular research project. And then if I've got time, I'll just talk about some key findings from the project because the project started, as I mentioned, in 2016. It was due to end this July. Because of COVID, our dissemination was impacted quite a bit over the past 12 months. So we have got a 12-month extension to the project. So we have got another year, but we are at the stage now where we have published quite a lot from it. And we're currently putting a book together, which brings the various different parts of the project together. So I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. And then hopefully there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions after that. Okay, so to start with, why research European higher education students? Well, I think, you know, socially it is a really important, higher education is a really important institution in Europe. 1/3 of European young people now go on to higher education. And in many countries within Europe, including the UK, the participation rate is much higher, often around 50% or higher. So it's clearly, you know, an important part of many people's lives. But also, I suppose, from a policy perspective, higher education has become a very important policy tool too. It's seen by many politicians and policymakers as a key means of driving both economic development, but also various social objectives such as social mobility, social cohesion, etc. So clearly an important part of European society. But I would argue that there has been no clear understanding of the extent to which conceptualizations or constructions or understandings of the higher education student are shared. So we might think of it, you know, obviously everybody understands what we mean by when we say a student, but actually, I suppose I was reflecting when I was writing the proposal for this project, I was reflecting on my own experience teaching in British higher education. And people were making quite a lot of comments as these days, everyone knows that students are consumers. But actually, I felt, you know, do we know that? What is the empirical evidence to suggest that students have consumer-like orientations? And I felt there were quite a lot of sweeping statements like that were made without a lot of empirical evidence to back them up. So the idea really was to explore whether there were common understandings of the higher education student across different national contexts, but also within different nations. Was it that everybody had similar understandings, or actually were there areas of difference and of contestation? And I suppose I felt that this was an interesting and important thing to look at because of assumptions that are made, particularly within Europe, about cross-border educational mobility. The Erasmus scheme, which sadly the UK is no longer part of, but wasn't until recently, makes some assumptions that, you know, you can just, spend a semester or a year in another country and, you know, the student experience is broadly similar. And also the policy initiative that the European Commission and the Bologna process have been driving to create a European higher education area where there's lots of emphasis on conversion and the similarity of systems. So I thought that, you know, it was kind of important for that, but also I suppose in everyday classrooms as well. As teachers, it's useful for us to know whether the way that we think about students is shared by students themselves, but also other actors within society. So that was the kind of the rationale for the project as a whole. But I suppose there are also some kind of, academic debates that it links with as well. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about those because it helps contextualize what we have done in the project. So it's argued within a lot of the academic literature that yes, students have become increasingly similar across the world because of the way in which many states have marketized their higher education systems and the impact of kind of neoliberalism, that this has made higher education systems across the world very similar, and as a result, students have become increasingly similar too. So it's argued that, for example, learning has been commodified, particularly in nations where students now pay fees for their study, and that students themselves are increasingly seen as quite instrumental. They pay their fees and get their degree, increasingly employment focused, really much more concerned about kind of what they're going to get out of their degree in terms of a job afterwards rather than the process of learning. And also, as I was just mentioning previously, quite consumer-like. And I suppose as well as kind of high fees being seen as driving this, people have argued that actually if we look at policy discourse, it's full of kind of understanding students in this instrumental way. And also some people have argued that over time, higher education has moved further away from learning and more being seen as a means to various non-educational ends. And there's a nice quote, I think, which sums up quite a lot of this literature here that I put at the bottom of the slide by Molesworth and colleagues. And they say that the inculcation of a consumer identity, and here they're talking about the UK, has brought about a more passive approach to learning in which students place much more emphasis on their rights rather than responsibilities, and on having a degree rather than being a learner. And that kind of argument had been made in quite a lot of the literature. And then when we focus on Europe specifically, we can see kind of similar arguments being played out. I've already talked a little bit about the Erasmus scheme, the Bologna process, and the European higher education area. And scholars who've analysed those have argued that actually what we're seeing is this kind of imposition of an Anglo-American model of higher education based on marketisation, fees, consumer identity. And that this has had quite a profound effect on student subjectivities, the way students understand themselves. And some people have argued that across Europe, students have emerged as consumers as a result of the Bologna reforms in particular, which have, some people argue, introduced quite significant market type reforms across the continent. So that's one aspect of the academic literature that sort of argues that students have become increasingly similar because of these social processes that we have seen in many countries. But there's also another side of the argument, scholars who've kind of raised some notes of caution about these kind of arguments. So some scholars have argued that policies aren't always translated simply into student subjectivities. What a student thinks doesn't necessarily reflect the kind of understandings implicit in policy. And in particular, people who've looked at higher education policy within Europe have argued that actually it can act as a kind of a cultural script that policy actors from different countries can pick and choose from according to their own national priorities. So it hasn't actually driven convergence in Europe as much as some argue. And then finally, some people have argued that, even within single nation states, we shouldn't assume that they're always coherent educational entities, that we can have lots of kind of differences of opinion and contestation within nation states. And so there have been some studies that have pointed this out in relation to kind of differences between higher education institutions, arguing that they have different understandings of what it means to be a student. And then other work that has argued that there are differences even within institutions between different groups of students from, for example, different socioeconomic backgrounds. So that's just a little bit of the literature to kind of explain why we embarked on this study and the kind of debates it's meant to articulate with. And that led me to these research questions and this particular aim. So the aim of the project has been to generate new knowledge about social constructions of the higher education student. And there are four main research questions that sort of lie underneath that. Firstly, how are understandings of the higher education student produced, shaped and disseminated by policymakers, by the media and by higher education institutions? And to what extent do these understandings differ within and across European nations? And then thirdly, how do students of different national and social backgrounds understand the role of the higher education student? And to what extent are their understandings consonant with those produced, shaped and disseminated by policymakers, the media and higher education institutions? So it's really taking those kind of four social actors, students themselves, policy, media and higher education institutions, and looking at the extent to which there's a shared understanding of students there. And so to move on now to our methodological approach. So first of all, to explore similarities and differences between countries, we collected data in 6 different European countries. And these were sampled or chosen to provide diversity with respect to 4 main factors. Firstly, what's referred to in the literature as the welfare regime. And so we have some countries on the kind of social democratic end of the spectrum through to England, the kind of neoliberal range of the spectrum. I can obviously talk more about any of these in the Q&A afterwards if you'd like to. Secondly, we wanted countries with different types of relationship to the EU, some that had been a member of the EU for a long time, others that were more recent members, some where there was kind of Euroscepticism, others where there wasn't. And then mechanisms for funding higher education, whether, for example, students were charged tuition fees or not, and the level of those fees. And then finally, mechanisms for student support, the money through, for example, grants and loans that might be given to students to support them through their studies. And so this table here, you don't have to read all the detail, but it just shows the countries that we chose down the left-hand side, and then those 4 different variables and how those different countries panned out in relation to those. So the idea was to have a good degree of diversity in relation to all 4 of those. So the countries we ended up with were Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. And then to explore similarities and differences within countries, we had 4 strands, each focusing on a different social actor, and I've already mentioned these. So the 4 strands were, first of all, we were interested in policy constructions. And so to analyse the policy constructions, we sampled a range of policy texts from each country and then conducted some interviews with policymakers in each country. So the policy texts, we had 4 groups in each country. We selected 4 texts from each of these groups, and I'm not sure if you knew this level of detail, but they included speeches by government ministers responsible for higher education, government strategy documents, documents produced by employers, graduate employers organisations, and then documents produced by national student unions. We then conducted interviews with policymakers from those different groups from each country, and also policymakers who represented university leaders. So that will be Universities UK in the UK and rectors' conferences, as they're called in many European countries. So that was the first strand, and that was all done through qualitative analysis. The second strand was focused on media representations, and this was done as part of a PhD project, which was part of the overall project. So here there was a quantitative analysis done of a large number of national newspapers. 2 were selected from each of the 6 countries, and that was a quantitative analysis, and then a smaller sample was chosen for qualitative analysis. And we've also conducted a qualitative analysis of a very small number of popular films or drama-based TV programs from each of the countries that figure students prominently. So that was the second strand. The third strand focuses on the perspectives of higher education institutions. And here we conducted a website analysis, both quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. The quantitative analysis, we analysed 180 websites and then 36 for a more detailed qualitative analysis. And then we also, and in this strand, in each of our 6 countries, we chose 3 universities to broadly represent some of the diversity of the higher education sector in that country. and conducted a number of interviews with staff in each of those institutions, trying to get a mix of junior and senior people, professional services staff, and student-focusing staff. And then finally, but perhaps most importantly, we conducted a number of focus groups across our 6 countries. Those 3 institutions that we went to interview staff members, we also conducted focus groups there. So in each of those institutions, we conducted 3 focus groups with undergraduate students, and we excluded international students from the sample because we felt that there were other issues there that would complicate the data collection. So that's a brief summary of the strands of data collection and the methods that we used. I just wanted to make a few other points about our methodological approach before I go on to talk about how we used NVivo, because it is relevant for decisions we took about how to structure the NVivo project. So first of all, I felt it was quite important that the researchers on the project conducted research by strand, not by country, because I felt by doing it by strand, it would bring in a cross-national comparison at quite an early stage. Whereas if one researcher had been, for example, doing all the data collection in Denmark, they would have had a great understanding of Denmark, but not necessarily how Denmark was similar or different to some of the other countries. So each member of staff, there were 4 research, at any one point there have been 4 researchers on the project, and we've each been responsible for data collection for a different strand in that, although there were a few exceptions, but I won't talk about those now. But basically one researcher was responsible for all the data collection in their strand. So I did the policy strand data collection, for example. Although we did a lot of the data collection ourselves as a UK-based team, we did make use of some in-country researchers, particularly in Poland for the Polish focus groups when we had to conduct them in Polish, and in Spain when we did likewise there. And I suppose that leads into my point about language, that we did use English a lot in the project. So for example, all the policymaker interviews were done in English, all the staff interviews were done in English, but we did do the focus groups in Germany, Poland and Spain in the national language, because we felt that students, if we'd done it in English, that would have had a very, it would have skewed the sample of volunteers very considerably. And then in terms of the documents, where a lot of the document, particularly on the policy side, were available in English, but where they weren't, we had them translated into English prior to analysis. In terms of kind of integrating the strands, we wanted to have some kind of common questions so that we could kind of compare responses quite easily. So basically, across all the kind of interviews that we did, we had a funneling approach where we started off very broad, asking our respondents very kind of non-leading questions about how they understood students, and then focusing down during the interview or focus group to ask them about specific constructions that are mentioned quite a lot in the literature. So for example, students as consumers, students as political actors, students as future workers, that kind of thing. We also had mechanisms for linking the strands together. So for example, in the student focus groups, we gave them examples of a policy extract and a media extract that we've analysed in the other strands of the project, just to ask them what they thought about that. And we did that in the other strands as well, and that was quite a useful way of linking up the different strands. We also used creative methods, and so in the student focus groups, we asked them to make plasticine models right at the start of the focus group of how they understood themselves as a student, and a second model about how they felt other people understood them in society. And the Times Higher ran a little article about this method a couple of weeks ago, which was quite nice. And then obviously there's our analysis, and that's what I'm going to talk about later when we move on to talk about NVivo. So hopefully that's kind of given you a flavour of the kind of methodological decisions that we took. There's a lot I've had to leave out here for time, but happy to answer any questions about that you have in the Q&A afterwards. So to move on now to NVivo, and I'm going to sort of split this into two. First of all, kind of how we used it to manage our data, And then secondly, how we used it to analyse the data, because I think both were really important. And I'm going to have to stop sharing this PowerPoint in a minute to show you the NVivo project. So apologies for the delay that will inevitably cause. So to start off with, I should say that we chose to keep 2 parts of the project outside the NVivo project. The media analysis, because that was being done by a PhD student for her PhD, and she wanted, well, we all thought it was best if she kept it separate. And also because the coding frame that she used for the quantitative newspaper analysis didn't really fit with the coding frame that we were using in the rest of the project. And the second aspect was the quantitative website analysis that was done outside the project through an Excel spreadsheet, not through the NVivo project at all. So those are kind of some exceptions. Then within the NVivo project, to mirror how we were doing the data collection, we decided to structure it by strand, not by country. And this also reflected our initial analysis too. And when we did the training with Christina and Sarah right at the start, this was something that they made us think about quite early on, about what was the most logical way for structuring the project to help facilitate the kind of analysis that we wanted to do. I suppose another important thing right from the start was, by using NVivo, it forced us to come up with a consistent and logical process for labeling our data, which I'm sure otherwise we wouldn't have done at such an early point. And that was really helpful in such a big project, sort of managing all the data. And I'll show you how we label that in a second. And then the other thing we used was a transcription template that we gave our transcribers. And this was quite helpful because we outsourced all the transcription to a variety of different transcribers, and that was helpful in terms of standardizing what they did. So I'm just going to now stop sharing this and share my NVivo project, hopefully. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Shout if you can't. So basically, if you look down here on the left, this is just to show, I suppose, that we structured it by strand. So we've got the focus group strand, interviews with policymakers, interviews with staff, newspaper articles. I said that we hadn't used NVivo for that, but I suppose as we're coming to the end of the project, we are going to import all that data in here so that we do have all the data in one place. Then we have the policy documents, and then we have the institutional websites. And just to kind of show you how we labelled this, every document had a similar format label. So these are staff interviews. 3 refers to the strand of the project. So the institutional strand was the 3rd strand. Int refers to the fact that it was an interview rather than a web analysis, which was the other part of strand 3. And then we have a code for the country. So D refers to Deutschland, Germany. And then we have the higher education institution that we went to, and this was the 2nd interview in higher education institution 2. And then we had a Word document where we explained what higher education institution 2 was and who was participant 2. And so we use that kind of labelling for all the other strands too. So for example, here we have the interviews with policymakers. So 1 refers to strand 1 of the project, an interview from Germany with a government representative. And then we did the same for the websites and the policy documents, and then the focus groups. For some reason, we didn't put all of these in kind of one long list. We split them by country, but I think that was just because the researcher who set that up had a preference for that way of working, and the rest of us thought it would be better to have them in one long line there. So that's just to really kind of show you how we structured the project and how we labelled our data. So moving on now to how we used NVivo for analysis. So I would say, from my perspective, the main advantage was the data management, that it really was really helpful in such a complex project in managing the data very efficiently and very effectively without too many hiccups. But it was also really important for our analysis too. And so Our initial coding was mostly done within NVivo, with the exceptions of the media strand that I've talked about. So we developed a common coding framework for 3 of the 4 strands. Here I'm excluding the media strand. And initially this coding framework was arrived at in a kind of deductive manner using the literature. So it was based on kind of, the kind of concepts that we had derived from our reading of the literature. But then we added to it in an inductive manner as we began coding our data. And we chose to nest our codes in a particular way. And in just a minute, I'll show you an example from NVivo and our code book. But just to say a few other things about coding before I do that. We had, as a team, we had regular coding meetings. I think they were every 2 weeks during the kind of data collection and coding part of the project, where we discussed new codes, where we discussed whether we should merge codes because 2 codes perhaps were too small, they needed to be merged together, or perhaps they needed to be split up, or changing the definition of codes, adding to definitions as we did more and more data collection and more coding of that. We used NVivo to note those possible changes to codes as we were doing our own coding. And then we brought them to our team meeting, and then based on the discussion and decisions at that team meeting, we then either made those suggested changes permanent or not in the NVivo projects. And so basically we were working separately on our data on our NVivo projects, and then we merged the project every month during the main coding period, just to make sure that no coding was lost, that we always had a master project that had absolutely everything in it. I'll just show you 2 aspects of our coding now. So the first thing I'm going to show you is we're going to go back to the NVivo project, and I'll show you our codes. So if you've used NVivo before, you know that they're under nodes here where my cursor is. When we were when we were in our main coding period, we under agreed codes, we had little folders that said something like Rachel's suggested codes, Jesse's suggested codes, and that was where we put the things that we thought would be useful codes that we had done coding under prior to these team meetings where we made decisions about whether we would go with those codes or not. So now that we've finished all the coding, we've just got a series of agreed codes. And if I could just close all these down. So as I said, we had nested codes. So I just wanted to show you, I suppose, how we chose to structure the coding. So we have some rather odd things like ambiguous plasticine. That was when we had plasticine models that we felt, it was a bit hard to work out what they actually meant. So that was just a reference to go back to those later on. And then right at the bottom, we had codes only relevant to the website analysis that we wanted to keep separate from the rest of the data collection. But everything else was used to code all the data that we have. So I'll just go through the codes in case they're of interest to you. So one of the things we were interested in is the social characteristics of students. So we coded for all these things here, social characteristics such as age, disability, gender, but also things like tiredness and unhealthiness, which came up quite a lot in the data. We had some codes about geographical orientation. For example, whether students were talked about as European, as local, as mobile, as immobile. And then we had, I won't go through all of these, but then we had some ways in which students were being conceptualized, which really gets to the heart of what we were interested in, their relationship to employment, to their family, to the HE market, to learning, to society, and then some things about the student population in general. And so in each of these, I won't open them up now, I could do that later if you like, but we've got all our coding from all of the strands. And then our code book, I just share this with you. Hopefully you can see this. So this is our coding frame where we developed our codes and we had descriptions of them all. So the descriptions on the left here are the things that you see in NVivo, but then we had a description of them all and what it meant to us. And this is kind of, what we added to. And this was a really, really important document for us in, I suppose, kind of, giving us a really good description of what that code meant. We tried putting these kind of descriptions in NVivo, but right at the start, but I think we felt that it was kind of just easier if it was in a separate document that we could, print out and have by the side of us when we were doing the coding. And also these descriptions were quite long, which was another reason for not having them in NVivo. So that's just to give you a little flavour of that. So then to go back to how we went about the analysis. Moving on for some reason. I think it's quite important that we're kind of honest about what we did and didn't do in NVivo. Although we did all the initial coding in NVivo, when we went further with our analysis, most of this was done outside NVivo. So what we did is we produced a summary sheet per country, per strand, based on those key codes and analysis of material within that code. And then that formed the basis for our subsequent analysis. We presented these documents in team meetings, so we were all aware of the issues that were emerging and we could discuss these and talk about what we thought was interesting. We initially held these summary sheets in the NVivo project, but then eventually moved them onto a shared drive that we were using. And then, as I was saying, these summary sheets provided the basis for our cross-country analysis within strands, and then also our cross-strand analysis across strands. So I'll just show you one example of this summary sheet to give you a flavour. Okay, so this is the kind of summary sheet that we produced in relation to the Danish focus groups. And this was Jessie, who was a researcher on the project, who has now left. But basically what we did was at the start, we had a kind of paragraph or two that summarised what we thought were the really interesting key things coming out from this particular strand in this particular country. So we've got some of the things that Jessie thought were most interesting about the Danish student focus groups. And then what we then did was for some of those codes which you saw in the NVivo project and in the coding framework, we wrote about what we thought was particularly interesting within that particular code, within the material in there. So, for example, one of our codes was student as beneficiary of taxpayer and privileged learner. And Jessie has written some text about what she thought were the kind of most interesting things in that code. And that was particularly interesting in Denmark because students received quite generous grants to study as well as having their fees paid. And that was a really strong theme in the focus groups, that students felt that they were seen as kind of ungrateful and spoilt and quite lazy as a result of this. So we produced this kind of sheet for all of the strands. I was going to show you some others, but I don't think I have time now. But I suppose we felt that was the most effective way for us of doing the subsequent analysis. And then once we had done that, again, our subsequent analysis was also done outside NVivo. Ooh. My light's going off here. So we then tried to combine both the cross-strand analysis and the cross-country analysis based on primarily, I suppose, answers to our research questions, because we've got to answer those for the research funder and, for the whole reason of doing this research. But we also, I suppose, identified topics that perhaps weren't quite so related to our research questions that we thought were really interesting from those summary sheets. And then also we have written a couple of papers that were in relation to calls for articles on specific topics, which again weren't perhaps quite so closely related to our research questions. And the way we've worked is typically one researcher has acted as lead on each topic or each article and has taken responsibility for bringing the data and the analysis together and working that through for the purposes of some kind of research publication. So I suppose through all of this, we have used NVivo at a relatively basic level, as well as that kind of initial coding that I was talking about. We've also used it through when we were putting these articles together or something kind of much more focused for retrieving data under a particular code and for running particular searches and queries that we felt hadn't really been answered in relation to the summary sheets, although that was quite rare, I would say. So I don't think I've got time for this, but I was just going to give you an example, a worked example of how we had used this, showing you the codes in the codebook and in NVivo. But I suppose basically this was an idea in one of our codes. We had a code, time and pace of learning, which emerged inductively through the coding of the Danish focus group data. So we then kind of constructed a code to capture any mentions of kind of time and how that impacted on understandings of students. And then we applied that widely across the data set. And then we ran searches to see how prevalent that was across countries and across different actors. We downloaded all the data within that code to analyse manually, and then made some manual comparisons by country and by social actor. And then that led to the development of further sort of more specialist codes outside of NVivo. So for example, in relation to this particular code, which is about the time and pace of learning, there was the idea of kind of university time, which emerged when we did this kind of finer grained analysis outside NVivo. Okay, so just now to kind of summarise what I see as some of the kind of strengths and limitations of NVivo for the particular research project that I've been working on. As I think I mentioned earlier, for me, I think the key strength was that it really did streamline data management. It made this huge complex project seem quite manageable from an early stage. And through making some early decisions about how we were going to manage it, I think that saved a lot of time later on in the project and enabled us to really manage the data very efficiently, I think. Linked to that, I think using NVivo forced us to make early and clear decisions about how we were going to label our data, which was really helpful across the project. We all had really easy access to the latest versions of the transcripts and coding. So I think, it helped the team work really well in that respect. It was very easy for us to search our own data, but also data other people had generated. And I think because of this kind of necessity of coming up with agreed codes in the NVivo project, it really did facilitate a regular discussion of codes and the coding framework at an early stage in the project. And I think that did, as a team, gave us much greater familiarity with the data set as a whole than we might have otherwise had. And then I think our detailed coding framework, which kind of wasn't part of NVivo, but we used alongside it, did help us remember what codes meant. And that was quite important in quite a long project with multiple researchers. Just to move on to a few limitations and problems. There was a point at which different researchers moved to new jobs at different institutions, and it was quite difficult, perhaps impossible, to use NVivo as we were using it across institutions. It was much easier when we were all in the same institution and could have the project on a shared drive that we could all access easily. We had some difficulties in storing the website, that part of the strand, and we needed to buy some special software to convert them to PDFs. And then I suppose one of the things that we did find with our data set that was, because it was so large, for day-to-day work, it was best if we deleted all the other strands. So when I was working on the policy data, for example, my working version just had the policy data in it. I deleted all the websites and all the focus group data. And as I said, as I've been explaining as we're going along, it was easier to keep other documents, such as those summary sheets, outside NVivo, just because I think access was more straightforward, other than having to go into quite a large project, waiting for it to open and that kind of thing. Then I think some other limitations which perhaps relate to our project specifically, because the period of data collection and coding was quite long and the data set large, it did become quite difficult to add new codes at a later stage of the project, just because of the amount of recoding was sometimes a little bit off-putting. And I think these are kind of how we use the project. Some of the codes that we did use were quite huge, And so those summary sheets that we used didn't always capture the nuance of everything that was in that code. We relied on the codebook for coder reliability, but looking back now, it does make me wonder whether actually we should have done some kind of checks amongst ourselves to check our reliability in applying the different codes. There were some frustrations for having to wait until the next project meeting until the code could be added or changed, but I think that's quite a minor thing. And then perhaps a limitation is that part of the project did stay outside of the main NVivo project. And then finally, just to comment that even the best laid plans can sometimes come a cropper. Although I emphasised the importance of our data labelling and how that was really important, there was a little glitch that occurred when we had a change of researchers, and I thought I'd explained how we'd label things, but I clearly hadn't, and so she labelled them in a slightly different way. So that had to be rectified. I haven't got time to talk about the key findings, but I'm really happy to talk about those in the Q&A if you like. But just to make a few points to conclude, really, I would say that there are loads of functions that NVivo has that we didn't use at all in our project, but nevertheless, I would say it was extremely helpful for data management and access in such a large project. And I can't think of how on earth we would have coped with this without using NVivo. It really, really did help there. And as I said, for me, another really important advantage was that it did force us to make decisions early about data management and labelling. And then finally, I think it did really have an impact on team dynamics. It made us discuss early and regularly what our codes actually meant, rather than all working individually. And I think bringing the team together at an early point for those kind of regular coding discussions was really helpful in terms of the team dynamics, but also the broader kind of intellectual work that we were doing in the project. So hopefully that's given you a flavour of how we used NVivo in the project. Really happy to answer any questions that you may have now, and also my colleagues might like to answer any that apply to them specifically. But if you'd like to find out more, we have a website about the project, and we also have a fairly active Twitter account. So thank you very much for listening. Sorry that was at such pace, but happy to answer any questions you might have now.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. A very, very full talk, lots of information, tricky to talk through such a massive project, but I really appreciate, and I think everybody here does too, the extent to which you gave us an insight into the use of the software specifically. It's so very rare to see that, and the fact that you actually showed the project itself, I really appreciated that. So thank you so much. We do have lots of questions from the group here. I think everybody was really stimulated by the talk. I'm going to start by a question from Karen, who asks whether the plasticine models that were created were stored as photographs inside the project.
Yes, they were, and then it was really easy to code them. Actually, we just coded them as if they were text, and then when we retrieved, the data under a particular code, they popped up. So it was really easy to do that, and that was a surprise how easy that was. But that was, and we've used those plasticine models quite a lot in our analysis and writing up.
Perfect, thank you. Inga had a few questions. I'm going to pose one to you just now. It was to do with translation. So could you specify how translation was done, both in terms of language, but also how country-specific policy terms and their kind of functional equivalents in other countries were translated and identified for the purposes of comparison?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So basically, we used professional translators for the policy documents and for the focus groups that weren't in English. So that was in some ways relatively straightforward. But I suppose that's one of the kind of interesting things that we've been thinking about as we've been analysing data is kind of country-specific terms. And so some of those, just don't have a very good translation in English, but often, represent something quite important about that country and the kind of ideas that we're trying to engage with. So, for example, in Germany, the idea of Bildung doesn't have a kind of, a really kind of straightforward English translation, but it summarizes quite a lot of what people talked about the importance of the kind of the German higher education system. And there were some other terms like that, which, which were important to our participants and don't necessarily have a kind of, an English equivalent, but often sort of flagged up an issue that doesn't have, direct comparisons in other countries. And I suppose when we were kind of struggling with understanding some of those, sometimes our participants explained exactly what that meant. Where that wasn't the case, we had a project advisory group, and so we sometimes used them for that kind of language specific point. But in other cases, it kind of, did really affect, drive our analysis as to kind of, what are some of the kind of very kind of unique or atypical aspects of understanding the student in some of the particular countries.
Great, thank you, Rachel. Andrew asked a question, which a couple of other people are interested in as well. It was to do with whether there are any features of the software that you would use if you were going to do it again.
Yeah, I think part of it, although it was a 5-year project and now it'll be a 6-year project, it did still feel really rushed because we had to get so much done. And so perhaps if I was going back again and doing the same kind of project and didn't have to worry about all the kind of, the data collection and the logistics of that, I think I would probably spent a bit more time thinking about how we could have used some of the other analytical features to help our analysis, because I think, at relevant points, I just didn't have the time or kind of mental capacity to really kind of go back and do the learning, I think, that it might have been necessary to do to really get the full functionality out of NVivo for that sort of second stage of analysis. So I think we used it really effectively in terms of managing the data and initial coding. It was really from that point onwards where we kind of shifted to doing things more manually. And I think perhaps, if I had been a more experienced user of NVivo, there might have been, quite a lot we could have done within the project that we wouldn't have needed to do outside it. Okay,
thank you. I think it's not an uncommon experience, because at the end of a project, time is of the essence, and it's often coding that takes a very long time, right? And so then there's not an awful lot of time left for the rest of it. So I think that you would not be alone in that experience. I have a question here from Vasiliki, who says, excuse me, that was a very helpful talk, Rachel, thank you. And then Vasiliki asks, do you feel that codebooks in qualitative research should become accessible to the research community? Because in quantitative research, quantitative researchers do that systematically, but we're probably less prone to this sort of exchange in the qualitative space. So do you have any reflections on that?
I mean, so we're thinking about these questions now because we're starting to prepare the data for archiving. And so I think, if people want to understand how you've kind of, coded the data, I think it is quite important. Yes, so I think it can be really useful. And I think with our project, I probably wouldn't have any problems sharing our code book, but it might, some parts of it might need to be rewritten, because we did write it as a kind of working document for the team, not as a public document. Not that there's anything kind of, very sensitive there at all, but it's just that it isn't always written the kind of, best English or kind of the best kind of most logical order in terms of those descriptions of codes. So I think, in terms of kind of, being open about your methodological process and analytical processes, I think it probably would be helpful to share it. We probably will share it when we offer our data to the archive for archiving, but we might need to kind of tidy up, I think, some of our descriptions of codes.
Yeah, it's the working versions versus the perfected. Yeah. Christina, did you want to add something to that in relation to shared codebooks?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting point and something that we've been exploring at the CAQDAS Networking Project recently, actually. I thought some of you might be interested to know. There is an an exchange standard that's being developed between many of the major qualitative software programs, including NVivo, which means that it's now possible to move analysed projects from one program to another, which is something that's potentially useful for one of the issues that you raised, Rachel, about when researchers move to other institutions who maybe are used to using other tools. But one part of that is exchanging codebooks, partly for archival reasons. So at the moment, we're looking at hosting on our website codebooks that can be shared amongst researchers in the context of bringing them into qualitative software programs like NVivo. So just wanted to kind of let people know about that. When we have more to tell you, then we'll be sharing that more widely. But hopefully that's something to bear in mind.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Christina. We have a couple of minutes left. So there's a question from Owen Ross here about the focus groups. And Rachel, you mentioned that you had done what I thought was a really sort of nifty piece of crossover across the different streams, providing the focus group participants with extracts of other data. And Owen wanted to know whether you gave the students in the focus groups that information before the focus groups or during the focus groups?
No, we gave it to them during the focus groups, and we gave it to them at the end of the focus groups, because it relates to the kind of point about funneling that I was mentioning, that we wanted to sort of start off either the focus group or the interview in a very kind of open-ended way, and then just sort of see what they thought, not kind of give them any ideas. That's why we got them to do the plasticine modelling right at the start, and then increasingly sort of funnel as we went through. And so towards the end, as I said, we asked about specific constructions, and then right at the very end, we sort of gave them constructions that, you know, in ways in which other people had constructed them, and asked what they thought about that. So we didn't give them to them in advance. But the extracts were quite short, and they were very easy for them to read during the focus group.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. The last question that I'm going to pose, but just to let everybody know that there's quite a few other questions that we haven't got to yet. And what we typically do is that we would send those to Rachel, and she would see whether she can have a look at them after the day. But just one more question here before we end today, which is to do with the transcription template. So Gillian Chew's asking, can you give some comments on how you came up with the transcription template and what it consists of?
Yeah, it was really simple, really. It was just a Word document where we just asked, you know, we just had the date the focus group was conducted, where the institution, using our institution coding, who the researcher was, who the participants were, and any kind of, or a number of participants, and then any kind of contextual information. So it was a really kind of simple Word document that we put together, but it was just to make sure that we had basic data about each of those transcriptions on them, rather than having to look elsewhere for them.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Christina, if you wanted just to take us to the final slide there, I'm going to say thank you so much to Rachel. It's been such a rich session today. Lots and lots of questions, just testimony to how engaging this all was, and how much they would everybody would like to talk to you a little bit more about the project. But that's all the time that we have at the moment. And if it's okay with you, Rachel, Christina and I will send you the outstanding questions for you to have a look at. There's a couple of in there that are questions perhaps for Christina and I to do with functionality of the software, and then a few more are sort of a bit more substantive for Rachel, so I'll pass those on. So thank you so much, Rachel, for your time today, for sharing with us the project. Thanks everybody for being here. It was a really engaging session. Thank you so much for all the questions, and we do really hope to see you at our other webinars in the future. And as Christina said earlier on, we're going to start advertising the ones after March very shortly. So hope to see you all then, and we wish you all the very best, and keep healthy, keep safe, and have a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.